Hey guys, and welcome to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Andy Hutchinson and I'm a former technology and gadget journalist with over 30 years experience in magazines, newspapers and TV. I've also been a landscape photographer most of my life and a drone flyer. I refuse to call myself a pilot for nearly a decade now. In this video, a request from one of my awesome subscribers. I hope to shed some light on the misunderstood use of ND filters for drones. When someone gets a new drone, they're often advised to also buy some ND filters to improve their video footage. Unfortunately, it's rarely made clear exactly how or why ND filters will facilitate this improvement in quality. It's one of those standard pieces of advice, like being told to use the rule of thirds in photography, that's often dispensed by people who actually have no fucking idea what they're talking about. So, if you've been puzzled by the ND filter conundrum, then allow me to demystify the subject, starting with what precisely they are. On the front of your drone is a piece of glass that is protecting the lens behind it. This glass is perfectly clear, and assuming you've been cleaning it regularly with a microfiber cloth, will let as much light as possible into the lens and then onto the sensor. Most of the time, having as much light flowing into the camera is a good thing, but not always. Sometimes you want to reduce the light, the same way you wear sunglasses to reduce the amount of light hitting your retinas. At their most basic level, ND filters are nothing more than sunglasses for your drone. They're a thin layer of darkened glass that sits in front of the lens and sensor and reduces the amount of light flowing through both. They come in various strengths according to the amount of light they block. The weakest strength of ND filter is an ND2, which reduces the amount of light by 1 stop. You can simulate that effect by using the exposure compensation on your drone or camera and setting it to -1. The ND numbers double for each further stop of light reduction. So ND4 is 2 stops, ND8 is 3, ND16 4, ND32 5, and ND64 is 6. So if you have a set of ND filters, you can physically reduce the amount of light hitting the sensor by sticking your drone's sunglasses on in place of that clear piece of glass. So far so good. Just sunglasses for your drone. That's literally as sophisticated as they get. Now the big question of course is why you want to reduce the amount of light hitting your drone's camera sensor. There are actually several reasons why you might want to do this. So let's start with the best known one, getting that cinematic look in your videos. For very boring and completely unimportant reasons, the vast majority of feature films have always been shot at 24 frames per second. This frame rate, which has some slight motion blur to it, is what we perceive as looking cinematic and real. It's the frame rate we've been trained to equate with film-like through watching feature films. Watch video at 30 or 60 frames per second and it has a slightly unnatural Mexican soap opera look to it. Unfortunately, it's not as simple as sticking your drone's camera in 24 FPS mode. There's an extra step without which you won't get the big screen look. In order to simulate the cinematic film look on digital cameras, you also have to ensure that your shutter speed is double your frame rate. So, if you want to shoot at that cinematic 24 frames per second, your shutter speed should be 1/48th of a second. Frame rate dictates the number of frames exposed per second, but the shutter speed dictates how long each one of those individual 24 frames are exposed to light. Why does shutter speed have to be double frame rate? It doesn't really matter, but here's the explanation anyway, in case you want to bore people shitless at parties. It's so that the shutter is open for half the exposure and closed for the other half, and it's this that gives the footage that cinematic motion blur. Setting your drone's video frame rate to 24 is as simple as selecting it in the settings, but the problem is this. If it's a bright sunny day, your drone's camera will select a fast exposure, certainly nowhere near 1/48th of a second, because otherwise your video or photo will be overexposed. So in order to enable the camera to shoot video at 1/48th of a second, we have to reduce the amount of light coming in the front, and you guessed it, that's what we do with the ND filter. You've probably worked out now why there are different strengths of ND filter too. The filter you use will depend entirely upon how sunny it is. If it's a cloudy day, you might be able to get away with an ND16, but if it's a blue sky summer day here in Australia, you'll need something akin to welding glass on the drone camera. Now, you may have one of the more expensive drones on which you can select the aperture manually. The aperture is literally the size of the opening made by the lens. The smaller the hole, the less light gets in. And if you do have a drone on which you can manually select the aperture, then you may be able to do without ND filters entirely, because you can restrict the amount of light hitting the sensor by selecting a small aperture like f11. Unfortunately, many of DJI's drones have a fixed aperture, usually f2.8, and therefore the lens is wide open all the time. So if you have a drone with a fixed aperture, such as the DJI Air 3 for instance, and you want to shoot at that cinematic 24 FPS, then you'll need an ND filter to reduce the amount of light hitting that sensor. In practice, what this means is you'll have to experiment with different strengths of ND filters before sending your drone up into the sky. I'm not going to lie, it's a royal pain in the arse dicking about with those fiddly little ND filters, but if you want to have dreamy 24 FPS footage, then that's what it takes, Mr. Scorsese. So, put your weakest strength ND filter on. I'd start ND16, select 25 or 24 FPS if you can, and then set your shutter speed to 1/50th of a second. Have a look at the histogram on your controller screen. If it's not enabled, toggle it on in the advanced shooting settings. If the bulk of the graph is in the center of the histogram, then you're good to go. If everything's hugging the right side, then you need a stronger ND filter. If it's all on the left, then you've gone too far and you need a weaker ND. Rinse and repeat until you have a healthy looking histogram with a vaguely pyramid looking display. You can now shoot your video safe in the knowledge that it won't be blown out and unusable. So that's using ND filters to force a cinematic frame rate. But ND filters do have other uses. If you're shooting in bright sunlight, then your footage will probably benefit from an ND filter, whatever frame rate you're opting for. Reducing the amount of light on that sensor will ensure you don't have blown out, overexposed images if it's shooting photography or footage if you're shooting video. ND filters can also help prevent the so-called jelly effect or rolling shutter, to give it its technical name. Lastly, you can also use ND filters to take long exposure photographs. For drones, the perfect location for this is the coastline. Stick a strong ND filter on your drone, hover it over the coast, point that camera straight down and shoot a long exposure. Depending on how windy it is, you might be able to get away with half a second or more before the drone moves to keep position. And half a second is plenty to create that beautiful long exposure motion in waves breaking on rocks. Long exposure aerial shots look sensational, and I'd say this kind of photography was actually one of the best reasons to get yourself a set of ND filters. So that's ND filters for drones explained. When it comes to the ND filters you purchase, there isn't a huge amount of choice, and most people get either the big brand Polar Pro filters or the not actually that much cheaper PGY Tech filters. You'll hear a lot of bollocks talked about color cast when it comes to ND filters, which is when the filter alters the color balance and you get a faint orange or green hue to your footage. I've bought some of the cheapest ND filters known to mankind over the years, and haven't experienced this in the last 15 years. Even the really cheap stuff is pretty good these days. In terms of price, you're looking at about $50 for a set of 4 ND filters for something like the Mini 3 Pro. You get the ND 16, 64, 128 and 256 in the box, which will cover you for all eventualities. And that'll do us for this video. Do you use ND filters on your drone? Which brand did you buy? Please let me know in the comments section down below. If you got value from this content, please do give it a like and consider subscribing for more drone video and photo content from yours truly. Till the next time, guys. Ta-ta.